Your Majesties, Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 4th Global Child Forum Digital Action Lab 2020. Today we will be talking about data mining in the sandbox and children's safety online. We will explore ways in which businesses can think about how their products and services affect children online, especially also the topic of digital right to privacy. But before we deep dive into this topic, it is my honor and privilege to give the floor to Her Royal Highness Princess Sophia to formally open this 4th Digital Action Lab.
Your Majesties, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce the final Action Lab in Global Child Forum's ActionLab series, Data Mining in the Sandbox, Children's Safety Online. Children and the Internet have a complex relationship. On the one hand, the Internet provides children and youth with so much that is positive. Access to educational opportunities, channels to express themselves, a chance to connect with others. On the other hand, as we're all aware, life online comes with a lot of risks. To put this in perspective, 81% of the world's children now have an online presence before they are 2 years old. And this is just how children start their lives in the digital world. But it continues. In the US, for example, 95% of teens have or have access to a smartphone, and 45% of those teens are online an average of 9 hours each day. This represents a massive online footprint. Furthermore, there is a growing popularity of online services and apps targeting the young, and we can only assume that these services will increase. This raises questions about how we design online spaces for children. Because the more time that our children spend online, the more of their information is being stored, collected, and shared. This practice of data collecting has far-reaching consequences for children's fundamental rights. And companies have an enormous responsibility to ensure that their practice and policies do not violate children's privacy. Some provisions are already in place, which attempt to regulate how online providers can market to children. For instance, a website operator cannot require a child to disclose personal information in order to participate in an online game. But we need these measures to be enforced and for companies to understand how they can conduct their business responsibly. The generation that built the Internet was able to grow up without a digital record of their every purchase, every digital interaction, and every digital baby step that they ever took. Their past and privacy was theirs. But today's generation and the ones to come will be held accountable to their inescapable online identities. How companies and current regulations respond to these shifts is one of the most fundamental questions of our time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Royal Highness, for those important words. Already so many important things have been mentioned: data collection, online marketing, and thank you, Your Royal Highness, for also framing today's session as a fundamental rights issue. And I'm sure our first speaker will agree with that. It's my pleasure to introduce as our first speaker, Professor Dr. Veronica Barassi. Veronica is Professor in Media and Communication Studies at the University of St. Gallen. She is an anthropologist and, maybe not unimportant in the framework of today's discussion, a mother of 2 children, with a focus on the impact of AI on human rights and democracy. Most recently, she has also published a book called Child Data Citizen on how tech companies are profiling us from before birth. Veronica, welcome.
Thank you.
I think you are muted, Veronica.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rubens, for the introduction. First of all, I would like to say how honored I am to be here. I have been researching themes of data rights and children for 5 years, and I am very grateful to be given the opportunity to talk about some of my thoughts and some of my findings today with you. Now, I started to work on children's data rights because I believe that over the last decade, we witness a techno-historical transformation of immense proportions. I'm not only referring to the rise of big data or the development of AI systems, but I'm also referring to the emergence of complex data environments where our data is shared, is aggregated, and is used to produce unique ID profiles, which are then sold and resold to make data-driven decisions about our lives. So in our complex data environments, what's starting to emerge is that the line between consumer data and the line between citizen data is becoming increasingly blurred. Now, the 2008 Cambridge Analytica scandal was perhaps the very first example in the public domain of the ways in which our data, which is collected for consumer purposes, so on a social media platform, then can be used to politically profile us and try to influence our political choices. But the Cambridge Analytica scandal is really one of the many different examples in which the line between consumer data on one hand and citizen data on the other is becoming blurred. In 2018, we saw the issue about Amazon selling facial recognition software to law enforcement and border police and different civil society organizations flagging up the problem of the data that they stored. In a completely different example, in the UK in 2018 again, the Labour Party bought the data of new mothers and mothers-to-be to profile them politically. So once we realize that the data, boundary between consumer data and citizen data is becoming blurred, we also have to realize that in these complex data environments, children are particularly vulnerable. For the very first time in history, we have developed technologies and systems which are able to track children's data and everyday data from the moment in which they're born, and as I show in my research, sometimes even before they're born, through pregnancy app and ovulation tracking apps, but from the moment in which they're born and then throughout their life, right? Now, today, multiple agents are collecting this data of children, and they're collecting multiple varieties of data of children. They're collecting educational data, health data, social media data, home life data, many different types of data. This is data that is not only consumer data, it's actually data that is filled with sensitive information about the children's background, about their religion, about their ethnicity or their class, their gender, their politics, their mental health, and following the COVID-19 pandemic even more, and also the data about their parents, right? So what I really want to bring to the table today is this understanding that when we talk about children's data, we are not only talking about their data, their right to privacy. We're not only talking about the right to a commercially free childhood. We are actually, or even their consumer rights. What we are talking about is their citizens' rights. So rights like self-expressions, rights like non-discrimination, right? And obviously, because we are talking about citizen rights, and because we are living in complex data environments where the line of the consumer and the citizens is becoming blurred, our governments are stepping up. over the last years, we saw the development of the General Data Protection Regulation, which was a fundamental and important step. And there are also many different special provisions for children. Now, although I welcome all these steps, which I think are fundamental, throughout my research, I came to the conclusion that the current legal frameworks have some key problems which actually prevent them from adequately protect children's rights. So one particular problem that I found was the issue that many data protection regulations focus on the idea of parental consent and the idea of privacy, transparency. So they require businesses and organizations to make their data collection practices transparent and provide consumers with the possibility to opt out or to be forgotten, right? To request to be forgotten. Now, one of the main problems with this regulation is the fact that parents do not have the material time to read the terms and conditions. And so their parental consent is not really informed. I myself calculated that if I had to read all the terms and conditions in my children's lives, I would need to have another full-time job. And but also the other thing that the current data protection regulations do not take into account is the fact that in the majority of cases, parental consent is not a choice. We are often forced to comply and give our consent. This is again another personal example, but after 5 years writing and researching on children's data rights, I found myself signing up to the terms and conditions of Google Classrooms during the pandemic because I didn't have a choice. I asked the school to find an alternative platform. The other parents did not agree, and I didn't have the choice. My choice was whether I decided to take my children out of education or I had to comply. So this idea of forced compliance is something that is happening in the everyday lives of many parents and many families. And I think that data regulations at the moment that focus on individual choice and transparency do not take into account this fundamental problem. The other problem that is not being addressed in current legal frameworks is the problem of aggregated profiles. In 2018, I wrote a report together with the CEO of Privacy International on home life data, where I basically shown that most of the data that is collected from our homes is aggregated data. It's not only personal data, it's the data of the family together, and it's taken from the data of children is collected through adult profiles. Now, because these technologies are not targeted or designed for children, they collect a lot of children data, but they do not have to abide to the GDPR special protections or the COPPA regulations, right? So, so this is one of the fundamental points, the fact that at the moment children are interacting with technologies that are not designed or targeted at them and are nevertheless collecting their data. And we do not have a system in place to protect them. So to conclude, I think that once we break down the problem of children's data, I think that we realize that we are at an historical junction, that we are bearing witness to a fundamental techno-historical transformation, and that we have the responsibility to find a solution. Now, my personal opinion is that we need to rethink current business models, and we need to critically reflect on the ethics of businesses that work on the processing and the accumulation of children's data. I also believe that it's time to find alternative business models. I think it's time to focus on technologies that are there, that are privacy by design or are designed specifically with the idea of protecting children. I think also that this might be and turn out to be an intelligent move in the future, because I believe that there's going to be greater demand for privacy by design technologies. After all, as I always say, we haven't designed planes or cars in a safe way. We can't expect our AI technologies to be immediately secure and safe for our children, but there's a lot of work to be done. And we have the responsibility to start working on this, not only for our children, but for our society as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. That is a very powerful statement. And I would like to say to all our viewers and participants that after our next guest, we'll go into a panel with all three speakers, where you can also ask your questions to the speakers. So make sure that you have your pen ready to note your questions down. I already have so many questions after this fantastic intervention by Veronica, but I will keep them for now. And we will go to our next two speakers first, which is Mr. Dylan Collins, CEO of Super Awesome. That is a nice business card, Super Awesome CEO, who works with digital media entrepreneur, focusing on the technology platforms that is underpinning online children entertainment. And he gets his practical experience from an extended family with a lot of nephews and nieces, I understood. And Martin Ferris, who is the Chief Operating Officer from Soapbox Labs, global leader in speech technology for children and creating immersive online play and learning experiences. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you, Ruben.
So can I ask you, Dylan, to start off and tell us a little bit more about what you're working with?
Sure. I think Veronica described the landscape extremely well. And in fact, I suppose it's probably rude to start off with a complaint, but I wish that we had twice or three times the amount of time here to talk about all of the interesting subject matter that has been brought up so far. So as Ruben said, my name is Dylan Collins. I'm CEO of the very humbly named Super Awesome. We are one of the companies that invented the kid tech category. And let me talk a little bit about that, I suppose, by way of our history and how we see the world. So about 6 or 7 years ago, it became apparent to us, everything that Veronica described, that fundamentally the internet was not designed for children, but was being used increasingly by larger numbers of kids. And, the internet has been designed as a place for adults that is driven, by data to deliver personalized experiences. And, as we spoke to a lot of major technology companies around the Valley, it became clear that no one was really grasping that the future of the internet was going to be a much, much, much younger composition. And on top of that was going to require adherence and design for all of the new children's privacy laws that were being rolled out. So we started Super Awesome fundamentally to build the software that allows companies to safely engage with children. So built not just for privacy, but also what we consider to be digital responsibility. So, just to give you a sense of our scale, our products, which are used across parental consent, kid-safe ad monetization, and community, they power about 12.5 billion transactions every month. So they are used in thousands of apps by hundreds of companies to make sure that any kind of digital engagement with children is completely private, that their personal information is not being captured, and where possible, making sure that, as responsible a digital environment is easily creatable by developers, by content owners, really by all stakeholders in the sector. And we have about 197 people as of today, just focused on building kid tech solutions. So we are the biggest team in the world, really focused on building what I would call the internet infrastructure for children. One of the interesting observations we've had over the last few years, and I think it'd be interesting to hear the panel's view on this as well, is that the kid space and the kid tech space is quite unusual and possibly entirely unique in that all of the innovation is coming from government regulations and startups, rather than major technology companies around the world. And that's for a digital sector, for a digital vertical, that's very, very surprising. And it's probably rare as well that one would hear someone saying, or commending government regulations for being at the forefront of innovation. But when you look at new laws like the UK's age appropriate design code, which is not just thinking about children's digital privacy, but also thinking about, the responsibility of user interfaces and so forth, you really see that the kids sector is being shaped by an unusual set of forces moving into the future. So I'm very, very pleased to be here today with this panel, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Ruben.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for these opening remarks. Then we move straight on to Martin Ferris, Chief Operating Officer of Soapbox Labs.
Thanks very much, Ruben. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I guess the main message that I want to bring to the table today is that, it is possible to use data to innovate and improve experiences for kids with technology without necessarily compromising on their digital privacy. But it's about choices, and it's about decisions that you make in terms of how you implement technology. At Soapbox Labs, we've been laser focused on building speech technology for kids. We do that in a way that is accurate, that is age appropriate, and that is safe. And we process millions of voice transactions on a monthly basis without in any way compromising kids' digital privacy. So I'm coming at this really from a perspective of building an AI and a data-driven business that does respect the fundamental digital privacy rights of kids. And on the face of it, that sounds like a contradiction. How can you have speech technology that respects data privacy? Because everything that we hear about in the media with respect to the implementation of speech technology with things like smart assistants, for example, requires us to compromise on our data privacy. But it's really important to remember, and this might sound obvious, but it's worth reiterating, that it's really the underlying business model that dictates the approach to data privacy and not the technology itself. The technology itself is agnostic, but it's the business model which dictates how you approach the question of data privacy. And let me just explain that a little bit more. So if your underlying business model is one around commercialization of personal data in order to sell more adverts, then your driver is to learn as much as possible about those individuals. And then if you implement voice technology on top of that, how you implement that voice technology will be designed to fulfill that model. So in other words, it's data accumulation, it's learning more about behaviors in an effort to influence that behavior. And it's very hard to respect data privacy if your core business model is commercialization of personal data. And that, as Dylan has pointed out, has been the kind of primary business model out of Silicon Valley for quite some time. And a lot of these ecosystems are built for adults. But with kids, we have an obligation to commit to a much higher standard, right? In particular, in respect of digital privacy. And that obligation comes in two main forms. There is an obligation that is imposed upon us by regulators and by legislation. So there is a compliance obligation, although as Veronica has already pointed out, that legislation, those regulatory frameworks are flawed in some ways in terms of some of the principles around informed consent, for example. But secondly, there is an obligation on us in terms of the choices we make in building child-friendly digital ecosystems. And Dylan has already touched on this. We actually have to take an elevated ethical position in relation to how we implement technology in a way that is respectful of those digital rights. There are ways that we can do that. There are practical things that we can do. There are frameworks like trustworthy AI, for example, and within that, principles around things like privacy by design, which we can talk a little bit about later on. But signing up to these principles and these frameworks won't necessarily be easier and won't necessarily be cheaper. It hasn't been for us over the last 7 years. But long term, I think there is a really important point to make here that this can be commercially advantageous to us. So bake these principles into your business and you can reap the benefits. And I just want to leave with two main points around that. Number one is that if you are going to take that higher ethical stance, you need to communicate that to the market. And the market will respond to that. Parents will respond to that. I'm a parent. I will respond to a business that is taking a stance which prioritizes the safety of my children online. So that's the first point. And the second point is, as a business, work with partners that are consistent with your ethical position. Choose people to work with that are aligned with how you see the world and how you see how to implement this technology. So if you make these choices at the outset and you design these ecosystems with these principles in mind, then you can reap the benefits. And using data and technology to improve experiences for kids doesn't necessarily entail having to compromise on their digital privacy.
Thank you very much, Martin, for those words. So many interesting points already have come up. We have about 25 minutes for a panel where also our viewers can send in questions. Please do that by pushing the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and enter your question then in the Q&A section there, and it will come through to the head office here in Stockholm. So until we see those questions come rolling in, I will take the privilege of the moderator to ask a few first questions myself. Martin, you mentioned that there is actually a business incentive because you would say there is no economic incentive for companies to work in that way. But you said that there actually is a business incentive, and it is being recognized by customers and clients and parents. Is there data that you have that you can show or that you can back that up with? Because you so often hear from, well, why would businesses do that? It goes against their commercial interest.
I'm not sure if it does go against the commercial interest. I mean, certainly what we have seen in terms of response from the market, and I'm sure that Dylan can back this up, is that there is an appetite amongst consumers, amongst parents, and also I think increasingly amongst kids, and becoming a lot more digitally literate around their own data privacy rights, to have services that respect those rights. And we're seeing that in the market. We work a lot in the education market where there are very clear guidelines around what you can and cannot do with PII and what constitutes PII. But equally in the consumer markets, we're seeing a lot more of an appetite to take some of these core technologies like speech technology, for example, offline. So working on the device, so no data leaves the device in those circumstances. So I think it's early to be seeing specific data around that, but certainly the response from the market and the appetite from the market is underpinning that argument.
Interesting. And Veronica, to come back to you, I was looking a little bit into your digital footprint, which includes a TEDx talk, TEDx Mile High talk, in which you mentioned that this was very much about systems thinking and not about individual behavior. Is that something that you feel is recognized enough? And could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, actually, no, I don't think that that's being recognized enough. I think that we are really at the very beginning of this public debate about children's data rights. I mean, the transformation happens so quickly, and we, as a society, I'm talking about businesses, I'm talking about parents, I'm talking about legislators, we are really, really at the beginning to see the type of system that we have built. And I don't know if you've been following it, but over the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a lot of blaming parents for posting posting photos of their children on social media, for instance. This so-called sharing thing, right? But going back to the very idea that actually, if we have technologies that are not based on a reselling or on a sharing of children's data, if they have technologies that are actually there to protect families and parents, then we wouldn't have that problem, right? We wouldn't. The problem of children's data online is really about the system that we build around that data. It's the fact that employers will look at social media data. It's the fact that it's an anthropological transformation, you see. So that's what I'm trying. That's why I talk about systems. That's why I talk about the fact that it is not necessary. It's not enough just for parents or families to take actions or to blame themselves for specific behaviors, but actually we have to talk about this as a system. And I think that one way, and actually in this forum, it will be really important to talk about this as a system. One way in which we can talk about this as a system is to really critically think about business models. What type of business models we think are ethical for children, okay? And that's ultimately the question that I think we need to ask ourselves.
And before I go back to Dylan, Veronica, I can also maybe ask you a question that comes in from one of our viewers who says, looking ahead, if we do not take action, what do you consider are the main risks, short-term and long-term for children? What could be like a worst-case scenario where we're heading towards if we don't take action now?
Well, actually, the funny thing is that I think that it's not really long-term, the problem, you know. We're actually seeing the development of personalized education in schools, and which profile children and use children's data in ways to then target them with content. And that already is a massive transformation. It's something that will have massive implications in terms of how are these profiles constructed? How are they determined which content is right for which child? How do we assume that these profiles are not biased and are not stereotypical, right? So I think that the issues at present, there's not much debate, but actually it's not a long-term problem. It's actually a real-life problem. It's about I don't know, the examples that I often use is about the role of educational data brokers, which sell the data collected from students in the variety of settings. They sell them under unique categories or unique ID profiles in which they say, you know, students that they're a bit socially awkward, or students that are from this minority and so on. So at the moment we are actually we are not seeing it up front because it's a really a non-transparent world, but many of the implications are already out there. You know, most of our searches are determined on our profiling, and as well, most probably are our children. So I think it's not really about the long term, but actually it's about also now what's happening at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And Dylan, if I can turn to you for a second, you are obviously on the forefront of this development, also technology-wise, and the way you work with it in your company. What advice would you have for companies, and maybe not even directly to companies in the tech sector, but other companies that want to start working on this issue, and what should they prioritize?
I think they should probably prioritize listening to Veronica and Martin. You know, I think ultimately, you know, and this is sort of leading on from what's been said earlier, like, you know, we are at a transformational point in the history of the internet. Up until now, the internet has fundamentally, you know, just been used by adults. You know, we are now seeing, you know, upwards of 175,000 kids that go online for the first time every single day. So whether you are deliberately building apps and digital services for children or not, the chances are they are going to be using whatever you have built and whatever you have released out there. So, you know, in I suppose putting it in somewhat more engineering or technical terms, you know, everyone needs to be building compatibility for children. You know, that is just a default. You know, you are seeing parents that are now increasingly expecting parental tools as a standard on just about any service that their children are accessing. And this is moving from being, everything I'm saying here is moving from being an opinion into law. So just going back to the age appropriate design code in the UK, that's really the first piece of legislation that is making it required for any digital service operator, irrespective of whether they are deliberately seeking to engage with kids or not. If there is a possibility that children could be interacting with that service, then they have to be compliant with the various terms of those laws. So I sort of equate it to the same level of disruption when mobile came along and disrupted desktop. everyone realized, oh, we've got to now design for mobile devices as well. It's an additional component for what we do. Children should be understood. Again, that's a technical point, but children should be understood in the same way in terms of just how broadly applicable this topic is.
Thank you. And let me be devil's advocate here for a second, because panel is always more interesting when there's somebody opposing your views, and you seem to be very much on one line. So when I mentioned yesterday to one of my daughters that we were discussing this issue today, she said, yes, but privacy is dead, and I know that, and I accept that. And when I looked today in Financial Times article, I saw a beautiful quote that said, the blurry line exists, but the blurry line also shifts. So are the expectations from the audience and from customers still that high? And is that relevant?
Let me just jump in on that, because it's sort of one of those triggering statements that I hear. I would say a couple of things. One, there is probably in general more awareness of COPPA, which is the US digital privacy law, after last year's FTC settlement with YouTube, because as part of that, YouTube had to reduce their ad monetization for family content creators. And as a result, you saw thousands of videos being created by YouTubers complaining about the impact of COPPA. It was, I think, singly not deliberate, but it ended up being the single biggest marketing campaign for a piece of children's privacy law that we've ever seen, all done on YouTube. Secondly, we saw an initiative that launched 3 or 4 months ago called the Global Advertising Program, I want to say, and Global Audience Program. Which was a set of groups that came together demanding an end to any behavioral advertising for kids and teenagers under the age of 18. We are also seeing research that, particularly driven by COVID, you are seeing now a cohort of kids, particularly in what's called this young teens category, this 13 to 15 bracket, that are definitely much more mindful of privacy laws than ever before. And I think my final word on this, and I'll hand over, what you are going to see on this is that the notion of personal data collection is very much sort of falling into an analogy to big tobacco 30 years ago. More and more people are realizing, that it is probably not a good idea to be giving up their personal data. It takes time, it doesn't happen overnight, but you see more and more signs of that happen.
Thank you. I imagine that Veronica, as an anthropologist, also has a view on this.
Well, actually, I think that you should answer to your daughter that it is not about privacy. It's not only about privacy. It's about self-representation. It's about the type of opportunities she's going to have. So one thing that's why I came into this area of research, because I was really interested in an anthropological shift, which is a shift in the way in which we understand citizens, in the sense that, say, when social media was created in 2005, 2008, say between 2005 until it took hold to 2010, people talked about participating online to, it was this idea that the self could tell his or her own stories online. Everybody could participate to public debate, right? So it was a digital citizen, right? It was a digital citizen that self-enacted online his or her own rights and his stories and so on. But actually, what we are seeing with the creation of our data environments is the creation of a datafied citizen. Is the creation of stories about us that are created around our data and that precede us. So, say for instance, you're right that your daughter might say, "Oh, privacy is gone," but actually, when she's going to be 25 or 30, she might. I don't know, she might want to have a job and go through a job interview. And what if the AI technologies that will be available then will actually be able to access all this data? We are putting the technologies and the system in place at the moment. If we don't take action, this is what's going to happen. So again, if I were to respond to your daughter, I'll tell her, look, it's not about privacy, guys. It's about self-representation. It's about our choice to have moral autonomy. You don't know me, like you know me because of my work, but you don't know what my grandfather voted or what what was the political leaning of my mother, or if I don't know any details of my family, because I was freely able to choose the values that I associated with. Some of them are my family, some of them are not. So I think that this is what you should tell your daughter. This would be my answer to her.
There are a number of questions coming in around the topic of parental consent and the responsibility of parents. One of the viewers is asking, isn't the issue of sharing pictures of your children online more a matter of ownership of the picture and sharing it instead of data collection? And how do you deal with that issue of parental consent and the limitations that it has, both from a legal point of view and from what Veronica also said, a practical point of view? Martijn, how do you work with that in your environment?
There are a couple of different ways that you can look at that challenge. I mean, I think that informed consent, as Veronica explained earlier on, is a problematic principle in the sense that it assumes that as a parent you have the information that you require in order to be able to provide that consent, and that comes back to a principle around transparency, right? And when we're signing up to all sorts of data privacy terms and conditions, not many of us I do, but not many people spend the time to actually look through them and see what the detail is, right? So informed consent on its own is a flawed approach. I think that you have certain circumstances where there is a legitimate right to process information, personal data. For example, in an educational context, if you are a public body delivering education, you may need to may be required to process personal data and may need to get consent from a parent in order to be able to do that. But I do think that fundamentally this really comes back down to this principle of transparency, right? What is it that you are giving your consent for? And I think that part of it is not well explained. And just going back to your earlier point about your daughter, I mean, I think that Dylan made the point very well that, that whilst the dominant business model has run ahead of the kind of regulatory framework and enforcement, we're starting to see a second wave now where we have informed citizens who are understanding the risks associated with that. And as businesses, then we have an obligation to be ahead of that second wave. And I think that's where the opportunity lies.
Just to come in on that, I mean, I think, the majority of developers and service providers do not have a secret Machiavellian mission to deliberately capture personal data on children. But a lot of not all, but one of the contributing factors about, the challenge of implementing, parental consent and sort of understanding how time limited parents are is that, you often find that the teams working on these products or on particular areas in these products, and again, not always, but often, are not themselves parents. So they don't have that perspective. They are implementing, they are taking a logical approach. They are going, okay, a parent is going to read, this particular agreement, or they are going to read the consent request, or whatever the case is. But of course, as any parent watching this will know, they barely have time to sort of, sometimes make sure their children are not on fire, let alone sort of scroll through like a 16-page end user license agreement. So I think they're, part of the challenge here is just making sure that development teams are much more inclusive in terms of having that life experience on board as well.
Thank you very much. And of course, we shouldn't only listen to the parents, we should also listen to the children. That was actually the topic of one of our earlier digital action labs, and perhaps one of our viewers out there was present during that action lab and makes that bridge for us. Because we got a question in from one of our viewers that says, how can we give children a greater role or voice in the design and development and marketing of online platforms to ensure that their rights are protected and privacy is respected? Is that something you have worked with in your environments as well, Dylan and Martin, to involve the children in development?
I'll let Martin go first with that.
Sorry, I was on mute there. How can we give children a greater role of voice in the design, development, and marketing of online platforms? Well, I think, again, this comes back to education, and it comes back to transparency and explainability of what it is they're being asked to sign up to, right? I mean, most kids, particularly once they get to a certain age, kind of 7, 8, understand these things. They've grown up with this technology, so they understand, and it can be explained to them in a way that talks to their world. But often that effort is not taken, because we have these mechanisms in place whereby if the adult has given consent, then it's okay for the child to use the service. So the child is almost removed from the process in many ways. I think we have to stop doing that. I think we have to start making a lot more effort to explain the implications of using some of these technologies to the kids themselves in ways that they understand. Right, and that's clearly missing from the market at the moment. We can also do simple things like taking a lot of this stuff offline, right? So and just not collecting that information. But transparency is the key to a lot of this.
Dylan, did you want to add to that, or did you just pass it on to Martin?
Well, I was actually interested in hearing the voice tech perspective on that specifically, but I would echo that. I mean, I think you're seeing more children's digital privacy laws mandating that privacy policies can be read and understood by children. I mean, to be honest, if I had my way, I think that should be the upper limit for the sophistication on any privacy policy anywhere. Because generally they are incomprehensible, to the average reader. So I think I would agree with all of that. It is, I think Veronica's point on, being able to illustrate the consequences of this stuff, and where does your data go? And did you know that, if you register as an adult on a particular platform, your personal data and what content you're looking at and maybe, what city you're in is passed to these 100 companies who then pass it to 500 other companies. I think that level of education is still, in general, I would say, lacking.
Absolutely, and I think that's lacking with the general audience. I mean, we're of course talking to a little bit of maybe of a bubble here with a little higher level of awareness, but that's absolutely a point that we need to take on. And where Veronica, maybe you also elaborate a little bit on that, on what the role of that is in terms of education, in terms of parents in relation to their children when it comes to education.
Well, I think that education is essential, and it's a very important principle. I agree that terms and conditions should be readable by children, but I also believe that children won't read them, so it's something that we have to be aware of. I mean, but what I wanted to say really, I think that we need research. We do not have enough knowledge yet, like particularly to go back to the question from the audience, but how can we design online platforms that are more child friendly and so on. There is still very little understanding of how children relate to data rights, but also on their needs and desires when it comes to interactions and with technologies. And this is an example that I always make, and people laugh at me. But for instance, I've been dreaming for years to buy a social robot for my children, and actually, my child is dreaming to build her own social robot, right? So, but there's nothing in the market. Like I read the terms and conditions; those I read, and there's nothing in the market out there that I feel safe with. And I talk to my children all the time about these issues about data. And they are aware of this as well. So I think that education is there, and I actually think that there's a lot of this going on in families already. Like I have a student of mine who told me the other day, oh yeah, I grew up with my mom telling me that I shouldn't post this on social media, which made me feel very old because I thought he grew up to do that. But we can't be blind to the fact that education is already going on in family life. And what we could actually do is to create more spaces for research and for that debate and for that education, I find.
Thank you, Veronica. And with that, we have come to the end of this first panel session. Nicely, Bridges, we moved on to education, so that might be a good moment to move on to our next guests, two of which come actually from the University of Ghent in Belgium. We've got Ingrida Mirkaite and Professor Dr. Eva Lievens with us, as well as Alexandrine Pirlo de Corbione, who is Director of Strategy at Privacy International. Eva works on the legal impact of the design and the deployment of technology on humans and children. And Ingrida is, amongst others, working on a research project with a children's rights perspective on privacy and data protection in the digital age. I believe, Eva and Ingrida, you will have a duo presentation from the University of Ghent to kick us off with.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Eva and I are extremely pleased to have the opportunity to share our research with you today. And I'm now very excited because of the previous discussion and a couple of last questions that were discussed, which I think are a perfect link to the second discussion of today. And so specifically today, Eva and I will talk about achieving child-friendly transparency by involving children in the creation and the design of child-friendly information about data processing and privacy. I will start and Eva will take over in a few minutes. To begin, I would like to focus on two children's rights. First, children have a right to be heard under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It entails children's rights to express their views clearly and in all matters that affect children. And this right also entails, the guarantee, the right of the children to have these views taken into account. Secondly, as data subjects in the European Union, children also have a right to receive information about the processing of their personal data. And data controllers, who are also very often various businesses, are required to provide information about data processing to children in a concise, transparent, intelligible, and easily accessible form. And they also should use clear and plain language. In this context, the GDPR, national policymakers, data protection authorities have stressed how important it actually is to create information which is understandable to children, and so that this information is also child-friendly and age-appropriate. And the UK's age-appropriate design code is a very recent example of this development. At the same time, in practice, it is of course difficult to know what exactly age-appropriate and child-friendly information is and how these requirements can be implemented in practice. Transparency requirements have been around for a few years now, and still we rarely see child-friendly choices, design ideas, and digital interfaces which are child-friendly and that can be understood by children of different ages. In this context and in this environment, we decided to include children, involve them in our research, and ask what information formats and contents they would like to see when data protection and privacy information is addressed specifically at them. And so we spoke to 83 children aged between 9 and 12 years old, and we asked for their help. Some of children's creations in terms of formats of this information are illustrated in the first slides, as well as the design process. And so format-wise, when data protection information is addressed at children, they mostly prefer to see various posters, mind maps, online and offline games. And they also like to see various quizzes, vlogs, and animated interactive videos. Content-wise, children's recommendations were very concrete. very direct, and they usually featured specific examples from children's everyday, immediate, and personal environments, such as examples from their school life or examples from their home life. When different videos and vlogs are addressed to children, they should also feature people that children are familiar with. For example, they could involve certain bloggers that are well known to children, or they could also include explanations or speeches given by, for example, the principal of the particular school that children are attending, or the mayor of the city that they live in. Children's illustrations that we can now see on the second slide also featured many well-known symbols, arrows, and different colors and mind maps. Children found it very important that information is illustrated with many familiar icons. So we can see the Wi-Fi sign, logos of different apps that children use or that they know about, and also the trash bin, which of course represents the erasure of personal data. In general, children preferred animated, interactive, and playful information. And finally, to close, children also wished that data controllers, businesses actually presented information to them in a very clear language, in suitable language, age-appropriated language, so that information is clear and understandable to children. Thank you for listening, and I now give the floor to Eva Liebens.
Okay, thank you, Ingrida. So after conducting our workshops, we really found that involving children in designing data protection information is a valuable way of giving children a voice. This has actually a double benefit. It realizes their right to be heard in practice, and it can really help businesses to implement legal requirements effectively. And because, as we have discussed already in this seminar, it's not because an adult thinks that information is child-friendly that it actually is. However, it does require that when children are involved, that this should not be done in a tokenistic way. Their ideas should be taken seriously, and appropriate weight must be given to implementing their recommendations in practice. So those who involve children, so if businesses want to do this, they must be convinced about the added value that this may bring. At the same time, and here I really agree with the points that have been made before by Veronica and Martin. It is very important to acknowledge that transparency is not a silver bullet. Certain data processing practices are extremely opaque and difficult to understand for children, but also for adults. So even though information should be provided to children, it does need to go hand in hand with additional and serious efforts by data controllers when it comes to children's data. For instance, by conducting comprehensive data protection impact assessments or child rights impact assessments. And in some instances, by deciding not to process certain personal data of children if their rights are adversely affected. And finally, the efforts must be monitored and must be better enforced by data protection authorities who also need to take children's right to data protection seriously. Today, children's rights are still often low on the list of priorities of those DPAs, and one of the aims of our research project is to raise awareness and to make sure that they do consider children a priority in their work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these opening remarks. Before we will again go over to a Q&A panel, also involving questions from the audience. But before we do that, I give the floor to Alexandrine Pirlo de Corbione from the Director of Strategy at Privacy International.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this very important discussion today and giving us the opportunity to share the work that we do with our global partners and to advocate for legal and technological solutions to protect people and their data from companies and governments who are exploiting our data and technologies. And when it comes to the discussion today, and maybe taking a step back as Veronica did, when it comes to the use of technology and innovation, there are key elements here that we need to consider not only about the opportunities that these may bring, but also how do we manage the risk to inform the choices that we make, but also the decisions that come with that. And, you know, unlike a bit like governments, industry unfortunately has a very poor track record when it comes to protecting people and their data. There are various scandals that have made the headlines, but there are countless examples who never make the headlines. And, you know, this is especially true when we see this drive for increasing types of business models which depend on the processing of personal data and non-personal data to categorize, track, or monitor individuals online. And I think what's key here is that information is not just about the data processing element of it, but what happens with that data, the ways that it's looked at, and to look for patterns, for similarities in behavior or thinking, or concerns as well people might have, but also to generate intelligence. And on the basis of that intelligence, then decisions are made that can shape not only our futures, but also, you know, the opportunities that are given to us, be it social, economic, or political one. And while there are some examples, and some were mentioned today, of friendly products and services, they're not as mainly used as some of the bigger platforms. And when it comes to these bigger platforms, there are countless examples, and every day, you know, new levels of abuses, and often it's too late when we find out that those violations have occurred, because we find out when somebody's been affected and there's been a harm either to an individual or to a group, or they've been exposed by researchers, civil society organizations, or journalists. And here the reason why I'm bringing these elements is this poor track record does not engender trust or public confidence, which is key here when we're talking about a consumer group, and particularly children, who over the last few years have been seen as this new market opportunity, with an increasing number coming online, as were mentioned. But here the element to keep in mind is all of the concerns that we have and that we've seen and are well documented, even though we're demanding even more research on that and what the implications are. The risks that emerge from the digital footprint that is created through these interactions online and the relationships that are built need to be considered, because the potential for those to be abused often just at the click of a button. And so we need to be thinking from the onset about what are not only the long-term, but also the short-term implications of what that can be. Having said that, to be a bit more positive, is that there can be an alternative scenario. You know, this does come to the choices that we make, and also the choices that industry makes when it comes to designing their business models, but also their products and services. One of the things that I'm hoping we can discuss a bit further that we've observed is that unfortunately businesses don't know their consumer base enough, their users enough. They don't understand their needs, their expectation, but in particular, they don't know their particular threat models of certain categories of users. And we've done a lot of work, for example, on women, on LGBTIQ communities, journalists, ethnic minorities, migrants, and how their experience online is radically different to what would be the average user. And that's the case when it comes to children as well. There's really a need here to understand their particular context, because the failure to do so means that the products that are being designed not only might not be useful or being taken up because they don't meet a need from that particular consumer group, but they also fail to understand and take into account the risk assessments that should inform not only how they implement a product and how it's going to be used, but how it's designed initially. And I wanted to mention briefly two examples. We've done some work on EdTech, for example, and it was mentioned earlier, but with the pandemic, a lot more children have had to engage online to have their school and education experience. And what we're seeing actually is schools are not necessarily well equipped to understand what are the implications that come with public-private partnerships and how to regulate and enforce the potential safeguards that they're demanding. And then the second one is around stalkerware software, which is used, for people that don't know, by a person to surveil another person through their mobile device, which allows to gather information about their location or the sites and the apps that they use. this is actually primarily known in the context of online gender-based violence and in domestic abuse cases. But what we're seeing is that the exact apps are now being promoted to parents as parental control. But we shouldn't forget that the premise is the same when they're used in a domestic abuse case. The risks are still the same in terms of the security, and particularly that parents are fueling this stalk-aware market. So going back to just to conclude, I wanted to make two last points. The first one is we want to reject this dichotomy that you need to provide, you have to choose whether to provide tools to children that will improve their lives, or allow them to enjoy their fundamental rights versus protecting their data. And we've seen it over and over again: privacy versus security, or effective public health in the pandemic versus privacy. And that's a false dichotomy that we need to challenge. And my last message, maybe for people to remember, is that we need to design to protect and protect to design, and that should be at the core of the business model of the industry that is targeting children as consumers.
Thank you very much to all three of you for these opening remarks. We have approximately 20 minutes for a bit of a panel discussion with input from our viewers. So many interesting points made. I would like to start off with Alexandrine. You mentioned that businesses don't really understand the threat models when it comes also to children. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because we had that specific question before on what are the biggest threats directly for children, both short-term and long-term. Where do you see that going if we don't take appropriate action?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Ruben. It's something maybe drawing parallels to other work that I mentioned that we've been doing, and some of the work that I've been doing, for example, with the humanitarian sector and the use of social media platforms in that context. Unless you have a clear understanding of how those users, the environment in which those users are using social media platforms, some of the adversaries that they might have, it might be government, or it could be other third parties, or it could be other companies, or it could be also others within our own society. I think we tend to forget as well that there are these threats as well within our own communities that for some people might be a bigger threat than a company or a government. And I think there it really comes down to not treating their consumer base as one single group with the same needs, interests, and expectations from a product or a service, because that isn't a true reflection of how those are being used. So, and this also comes down to basic requirements of data protection, which would be to do an impact assessment to understand how are people or different groups in society going to respond to the way a product is designed, to the way then it's implemented. And for that not only to be a checkbox exercise, which is often what we see, but for that to actually be an intentional process that will then inform the decisions that are made at the design or the conceptual level. And linked to that, which obviously is not always a popular point of conversation, but we don't often take a step back to say, we're not going to go ahead with this idea. We tend to, try and find the loopholes or the exemptions or the way of interpreting a particular provision that allows us, or, for a company that allows them to process the data without really understanding the essence of the rationale behind these provisions, or to protect people. That's how they're designed and that's the purpose they're going to serve. So every attempt to go and around them will have an impact on the users ultimately. And then maybe a last point on the consumer base. I think that we need to also remember that the way that children interact maybe in Europe with some of these tools could be very different to how they're used in different contexts. There are issues around language barriers as well. A lot of our partners that we work with, a lot of the bigger platforms, we won't have the data protection policies or the terms of reference in their local language. It will be in English, so that's also barriers to think in mind when it comes to access to information and the access to exercise your rights as well.
Thank you. I want to come back to Ingrid also on that last point on the uniformity that we treat children with perhaps as a group, because that links nicely to some of your research. But before that, Eva, you were nodding, I saw, especially also on the part of impact assessment. Is there anything you would like to add to that point?
Yes, yes, I would like to pick up on what Alexandrine was saying about the data protection impact assessment. And it's a point that is very often forgotten. It's often called a data protection impact assessment. And people assume that the only effect or the only impact that they should check is on the right to privacy and data protection. But actually, it should be much, much broader. And especially in relation to children, I think that's really important to implement this in a very comprehensive way and to check for a design of a product or of a specific processing activity. Will this have an effect on, for instance, the child's right to freedom of expression? Will it have an impact on the principle of non-discrimination? Will it affect a child's right to education? And these are also things that need to be taken on board in this assessment. And so going a step beyond only thinking about data protection and privacy.
Could you perhaps give an example of a service or a product that we might view primarily in terms of privacy or data collection, but that actually is also a breach of or infringes on the freedom of speech of the children?
Yes, so for instance, research that we are doing in the research group relates to personalization of news content. So the news that you get in your feed or that you get on online newspapers. So you would think this is based on personal data of the news consumer, also if it is a child. So your news feed is adapted on the basis of your personal data, and it would have an impact on your right to data protection. But actually, there is more and more research that is claiming that the construction of your news feed also significantly impacts on your freedom of thought, on your right to form an opinion, which is actually a part of the right to freedom of expression. So that's what I mean about thinking broader than only data protection and privacy.
Ruben, if I may just add to that, one of the things that we're seeing, or not talked about enough as well, is the normalization of this technology and the surveillance within our everyday interactions. And there are ones that are more known, when it comes to social, using, I don't know, like a tablet or websites, and then that's a bit more like the everyday use. But we've seen examples, for example, where biometric systems are being used as part of school meals management, for example. And so children, they come to the canteen and they have to put their fingerprint on a machine, and that indicates whether their school meals have already been paid, whether they're part of a program. And when you think about that interaction, like, what does it mean in terms of the examples that we're setting as a society as to what are acceptable interactions or things that we want to see in our society in terms of the interactions we have with technology? And that normalization is definitely something I think we need to talk about more, because if not, it could go both ways. It could be that we tend to be so scared of it that we will end up rejecting it rather than embracing some of the potential positive effects.
Thank you, Alexandrine. Then I'd like to go to Ingrid on some of the things that you mentioned and that have been said that relate to that very much. Is how can we communicate with children in terms of their diversity? Because we tend to treat them now as a group, right? We're looking at children's rights as if they are one, but there must be so many challenges in the diversity within that group. And how do you deal with that?
Yes, definitely. That is a very challenging issue in children's rights law and also data protection law now. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child defines a child as any person who is younger than 18 years old. And of course, stemming from this, we can also ask many questions about the current regulation, which is in place both in the European Union and, for example, in the United States with the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. So the current groups that data protection law focuses on are children between 13 and 16 years old. So under COPPA, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, this privacy protection mechanism is mainly focused on children who are younger than 13 years old. And we have scholars who are actually arguing for a long time right now that teenagers are not necessarily always afforded the same amount of protection in comparison to younger children. And then if we look at the GDPR and the situation with Article 8 and parental consent, in Europe, we also see different ages. So children are classified in different groups according to their age. Member states can choose between 13 and 16 years old when they decide that parental consent would be required to join particular services for children. And of course, we are now facing the situation when a 13-year-old, in Belgium, can choose to join a certain service, of course, with the help of their parents, before a 15-year-old can do this in Greece, to join the same kind of service, just because the countries have decided to agree on different ages. And there are quite a few reasons for that, but we have quite a non-harmonized environments in Europe and also a little bit in the US.
So then my follow-up question to all three of you is what major changes would you like to see in the next 3 to 5 years to make the internet a safer environment for children?
Well, I think maybe my first reaction would be that we really would need to ask the children themselves. So what they would like to see changed in this environment. But from a personal perspective, I think today we have been talking a lot about what is possibly going wrong and problems that we see with business models. But I also think that there are some quite good initiatives going on. For instance, if we look at the efforts at the level of the Council of Europe, where 2 years ago there was a very, very comprehensive recommendation adopted on the rights of the child in a digital environment. I think there is so much in there, not only for policymakers, but also for businesses that really want to do their best to take children's rights into account. So I think there are opportunities to prioritize children. There are some initiatives by policymakers, by data protection authorities, but still, children should be more of a priority, and they should most of all be more visible. So the points that were made in the first panel, that the digital environment is not designed for children, it is designed for adults. I think that is absolutely still true to this day, and we need to start thinking in a different way about this.
So how do we do that, Alexandrine?
At the risk of sounding like the boring lawyer in the room, I think there is a couple of things here that we need to take into account. The first one is enforcing the existing mechanisms, while at the same time assessing and identifying where are areas where there are shortcomings within the current framework, and how to improve those to make sure that children are protected. And that comes down to a lot of the accountability mechanisms. Like I was mentioning earlier, there are still too many opportunities to make use and abuse of the exemptions and the loopholes that exist in the current regulatory framework. I think the other one, and we're seeing this, for example, across our work, there isn't enough information being shared across different sectors. A lot of the issues that we're seeing in terms of the risk to children we can draw parallels with other risks faced by other communities, and understanding, okay, if that's been a positive response or a positive development to protect this particular group, is that something we can make use to protect children online, and a lot more of that sharing, because what we're seeing actually is a lot of the same mistakes being made because a model is just being imposed in different sectors in the same way. So if we can learn a little bit more for children's rights advocates or those working on these issues to look at what, movements they've been working on, for example, the right of human rights defenders or journalists or women or LGBTIQ movement online. What are the parallels can be drawn in terms of improving their services? And the other thing is to rein in the power and influence of industry. I think particularly when it comes to a lot of things where it is a government obligation, be it to provide education, healthcare, and generally to protect children, we need to rein in the power that industry have to call the shots, and to be the primary providers of some of those services, and to rein that in as well in our societies.
To rein in the power of industry, which of course could be construed as a call for regulation. But for instance, when GDPR came, a lot of people thought that could be the silver bullet. We had like the panacea there, but we see very little behavioral changes to follow. Right? We click it away, we accept it, and it kind of becomes this thing that the line gets pushed further, and we don't really think about it. So how can we make tools that are actually practical, working for people to raise that awareness?
Well, I think actually the GDPR does provide very, very interesting mechanisms that we could use to enhance children's rights. So for instance, Martin was referring to privacy by design. And I think what could be really important there is to focus on these diverse design teams where developers talk to lawyers from the very moment of inception of a new service or a new product. We have the data protection impact assessments. There are flaws in the documents or in the instruments, that's for sure. But what we are also not seeing at the moment is enforcement by the data protection authorities. They're overwhelmed, they're under-resourced. So it's really about a division of responsibility, and they should also take up their responsibility in making sure that the instrument that we do have, that it actually is enforced.
Ingrid, I saw you. I saw you on the edge of your seat there.
I would like to add to what Eva just said, and I think we might need a small change in the direction in this conversation, at least sometimes, and we need to indeed talk about the enforcement and what national data protection authorities are doing, and whether their priorities with regard to children's data and the privacy of their right to protection are at the right place right now. And at the same time, in addition to all these discussions about the need for more education, for parents to be more involved in what their children are doing, for parents to, need to be on top of every service that their child might be using, we need to sometimes, stop and remember that these requirements are first of all addressed at technology companies, at data processors, at data controllers, at people who are processing the personal data of children. And so they, first of all, need to make sure that, their values or the basic principles are there, and they need to remember that, we have these overarching principles like the principle of fairness, the best interest of the child participation. And so if you base your service with these principles in the background, perhaps many of the current or past data protection lapses would maybe not happen. So we need to indeed talk about the distribution of responsibilities, and we shouldn't focus on one stakeholder, and we need to talk about a joint effort.
A moral appeal and joint effort. Alexandrine, I would like to give you the final word on that one to see if that is something that you think that would work towards the business community.
Yeah, I mean, in response to your question, I think it's important to differentiate where the responsibility lies, as Ingrida was saying. Our perspective is never that the responsibility is at the user level, not just because they might not understand. I think we underestimate how much people actually understand potentially, but not only about the risk, but about their own context, and that they can make decisions on that basis. But it also comes down to how much can an individual actually control, be it in the service they use or the device. You have some things by default that you can, uncheck, or you can change some of the settings and that sort of thing. But then there's a whole other element of things that we can't change. They're built by design into the system, and that's where the responsibility goes well beyond the user and actually falls on the, as Ingrida was mentioning, on the ones who design the systems. And I think it might have been Dylan who mentioned this, but this also comes down to who is designing these systems. Do they understand the ultimate user that's going to use their product? And we've seen that a lot, for example, with a lot of AI tools being developed, and that never work out because when they design it, they didn't think of the end user, and it doesn't become just a user issue, like a user X experience, but it becomes a potential threat if we don't think about how who the end user is, what's their context, and what needs to be taken into account.
So it's a joint responsibility, but it will not automatically happen. Thank you very much, Alexandrine, Eva, and Ingrida, for this inspirational contribution to today's session. Now, two speakers have already mentioned the age-appropriate design code, which has been developed by the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. This is a data protection code of practice for online services that sets out 15 standards that IT services need to meet when processing children's data. And it really is aimed at empowering children and putting children at the center of the technical design. So we're going to put some more information on that specific code in the chat. It's entered into force on the 2nd of September 2020, and organizations have 12 months to implement it. So if you're interested in that, you can find more information in the link that we're sharing in the chat right now. With that, we've had two fantastic and inspiring panels, and we're reaching the end of our 4th Digital Action Lab, but not before I hereby hand over to the Secretary General of the Global Child Forum, Kaisa Vicky.
Thank you so much, Ruben. It's been such a pleasure to listen into today's discussion, and also during the entire series, actually, of these Action Labs. And I just want to say a thank you to all of you for participating in today's 4th and concluding Action Lab. And it is actually tomorrow, 10 years ago, when we had the very first global forum here, and it was held at the Royal Palace in Stockholm. And as most of you know, we had hoped to be able to celebrate that by hosting another forum this fall. But that was, due to the circumstances, unfortunately not possible. But despite all of the obstacles we are facing in the world, we at Global Child Forum wanted to continue to provide a platform for further engagement on child rights and business. And we hope that this Action Lab series has contributed to that. And following today's Action Lab, or actually right now as we speak, my colleague is sending you an exit poll with a short survey asking for your feedback, both on today's Action Lab, but also if you've been a part of the others and the entire series, to fill in this survey. And please take a few minutes to do that, because it's extremely valuable for us to get your input so that we as an organization can continue to develop relevant tools and services for you. And Global Child Forum will continue to look for new ways to support the corporate sector in understanding the materiality of children as stakeholders, and to mobilize them and their peers to take action on child rights. During the coming year, we have a range of initiatives that will be launched. Amongst others, we will conduct our 9th benchmark, which is now actually the largest children's rights and business study in the world. We're going to look into more than 1,000 companies and benchmark their performance on children's rights. We will also continue to create interactive, both digital and physical spaces, hopefully, for us to be able to come together and have those kind of discussions as we have had today. And then, of course, we are going to prepare upon the return of some kind of a normality, to host a forum here at the Palace in Stockholm again. So go into our website and please sign up to our newsletter so you can keep up to date with all the things that we are planning. And I also suggest that let's connect on LinkedIn and be a part of each other's networks to keep the discussion going. So with that, I would like to thank all of today's speakers and all of the speakers who has contributed in this series and have given their time and shared their expertise over the past few weeks. I would also like to say a special thank you to my Global Child Forum colleagues and the team for their efforts in pulling together this series during the circumstances. And of course, also a big thank you to you, Ruben, our moderator, who has been guiding us through this series and helped us to dig deeper through sometimes provocative questions. And lastly, of course, a warm thank you to the Swedish Royal Family for their active participation and continued support for us. Her Majesty Queen Sylvia has been at the forefront in the fight for children's rights for many, many years. And her contribution to the well-being of children around the world has had a huge impact. And I will now hand over the screen to Her Majesty the Queen for her closing remarks. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Global Child Forum, it is my pleasure to close Global Child Forum's ActionLab series. As His Majesty said when he opened the first ActionLab a short 8 weeks ago, had we not been in the midst of a global pandemic, we would have been welcoming you to the Global Child Forum at the Royal Palace. But while our circumstances have changed, our mission has not. And these action labs have been a testament to that fact. The overwhelming turnout for these 4 action labs has been truly heartening. I know that you, like us, remain steadfast in your desire to improve the lives of children. And we all share the belief that business is and can be an agent of change. The past 4 action labs have tackled diverse subjects, from the risk of climate change for children's health to harnessing the power of the young changemaker generation. And today's action lab topic, protecting children online, is especially close to my heart. Throughout this series, we have heard diverse voices, from Dr. David Boyd, the UN Special Rapporteur of Human Rights and the Environment, to 16-year-old Loreen Wright, a climate activist from Canada. We have also had the pleasure of hearing from academics, researchers, legal experts, and of course, the business sector. What this diverse showcase of speakers illustrates is that it takes all parts of society to respect and support children's rights. And looking back at this series of action labs, I realize that all of the challenges that we have been discussing are challenges that didn't exist when I was a child. Surely there were issues impacting the lives of children, many of which continue to exist today. But the issues we have been discussing during this series, that of climate change, youth empowerment, data mining, they were not yet imagined when I was young. So what does this mean for our future and that of our youngest generation? In my opinion, it means that as we as a society must continue to innovate, change, and think bold, always with the best interests of children at the forefront of our thinking. As a global community, we must ensure that children grow up in a healthy environment, that they have the opportunity to go to school and learn, that they gain the skills and tools they need to participate in their local economy, and that their rights are always protected. To achieve a sustainable tomorrow, we must serve the needs of children and young people today and invest in their futures. And now my challenge to you is, ask yourself, how does my business, my product, or my service impact the lives of children? And what can I do to advance the lives of children, to ensure their well-being, and to create a just society where they can grow and thrive? These are the questions with a multitude of answers. And Global Child Forum is here to support you. The only wrong answer is not to ask the question at all. Dear friends of Global Child Forum, thank you for all that you do and that you will do as we support the lives and futures of children and young people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Her Majesty for these empowering words and for the commitment and engagement of the royal family. So once again, thank you for being with us. Please take the time to fill in the survey that Kajsa referred to, which would be very valuable for Global Child Forum. My name is Ruben Brunsveld. I was your moderator for these 4 sessions. For me, the main messages has been to listen to the younger generation, to integrate their perspectives in our decision-making in business, but also, as they have said, that we cannot forward our responsibility to them because the time to act is now and the responsibility is ours. With that, the evening and the darkness has fallen over Stockholm, so it's time to log off from this last Digital Action Lab 2020. Thank you for being with us, and I hope our paths will cross again.